I loved my wife. Let me tell you that right now. I had been with her since we were in junior high school. We were good friends then and she was my best friend. We shared a lot of things together, but when we turned 18 and started to realize we had feelings for each other, we started acting inappropriately. Let me introduce myself. My name is Cal Wilson, my height is 5'10", and my weight is 175, 180 or so. I don't get on the scale every day. I'm in good shape for my 32 years, and I still run every day, ever since my high school and college track and field days. I have dark brown hair with some premature gray streaks, but my best feature, I'm told, is my emerald green eyes. I work as a detective for the local police department. We don't have a lot of crime in our small town, so my job is pretty simple. My wife is Julie Wilson, formerly Julie Vickers. Julie and I were the couple that everyone said were made for each other. God, she's gorgeous. Long blonde hair, bright sky blue eyes, and a body that could stop a war. She's also 32 years old. After college, we decided it was time to get married, and for 10 years we had a wonderful life. I took her out for dinner and romantic dates several times a year, and not just on holidays. She works as a paralegal at one of the 2 law firms in our town. Jimmy Green is a guy who was a quarterback in high school, a guy whose bread was always buttered if he happened to drop it. In other words, he was the golden boy until he broke his knee while playing NCAA football. When he came back to town, his father, the town's mayor, decided to give him a job at City Hall, which worked closely with the sheriff's office. Jimmy always had a thing for Julie. Back when we were still in high school, he would bring us on dates and, even though he had a girlfriend, would openly flirt with Julie in front of me and his friend Cynthia. Julie, God bless her, never flirted back, although some of the things he said to her made her blush and me angry. I told him unequivocally that if he ever tried to flirt with Julie again, I would make him pay. He smiled and said I had nothing to worry about, that it was all fun and games. Jimmy and Cynthia had gotten married right out of college and he had already been working at City Hall for a year. How did they fit into my story? Well, I'll talk about that a little later. About a year ago, Julie and I had plans for Friday night when I got a call on my cell phone from Sheriff Barton. He said he didn't want to interrupt my day off, but I needed to stop by work. I asked what was up and he said all the patrol cars were busy and they had gotten a call about a domestic disturbance near my house. Since I was the closest, he said I could go there right away. Sheriff Barton didn't take no for an answer, even though I was scheduled to have the day off today. Not wanting to make a fuss, I apologized to my wife, strapped my badge and .357 Magnum pistol in a holster to my belt, and headed to the address he had given me. When I arrived, Sue Roberts reported that her husband Hunter was beating her again. He was drunk as usual and had decided to take his anger out on her and their children. I had to talk him down for a long time and drag him to the station. Sue, as usual, refused to press charges. I advised her, as usual, to get help, and she promised, as usual, that she would do so and get rid of all the alcohol in the house. I sighed in despair. Every month or two we would get the same call about the same situation. Today, however, was a little different. I was busy with paperwork at the office until about midnight, and when I got home, I saw Jimmy and Julie sitting on the couch. Julie looked like she had taken another shower since I had been summoned. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. What the hell was he doing here? I thought. What's going on, Jimmy? Honey? I said, leaning over and kissing her. I'm sorry about that. Hunter's been booked again, and I'm hoping Sue will either keep him or give him the help he needs this time. No problem, sweetie, she replied with a smile. Cynthia's out of town visiting her folks, and Jimmy called shortly after you left to see if we were going to do anything tonight. Yeah, man. Sorry about that. I didn't realize you had a date night tonight. Jimmy shrugged. I guess you're lucky you called, huh? A cocky smirk appeared on his face, and I was once again convinced that this guy was a first-class jerk. Now alarm bells were ringing in my head. Jimmy had always been a snake who thought his shit didn't stink. I decided to be polite. Well, I'm sorry to hear that, Jimmy. About Cynthia, I mean. But if you don't mind, I'd like to take my wife to bed and try to make up for having to go to work today. Oh, sure. Sorry about that. He quickly got up and walked out. I closed the door behind him and turned to Julie again. Baby, I'm sorry about earlier, I said, taking her in my arms. Next Friday I'll tell him to get Bill or Dave instead of me, okay? Julie knew what it was like to be married to a cop. She smiled. It's okay, honey. Jimmy and I were just having a little talk, catching up, you know? I smiled. No problem, babe, I said, and the alarm bells slowly subsided. Nothing in her demeanor said anything else was going on, at least. Maybe I couldn't trust Jimmy, but I could trust Julie. Hell, I'd trusted Julie for more than half my life. However, that was just the beginning. Over the next 2 months, we had 2 dates when I wasn't called away on one thing or another. Julie was losing her temper, and so was I. Unfortunately, while I was mad at my boss, she was mad at me. I was her husband, but I put work before her. At least that's what she thought. Hell, I couldn't even blame her for thinking that. Cynthia had to leave town more and more often when her family moved to the big city. She would go away for long weekends when they needed something. One day she came back early Sunday morning, and the next thing I knew I got a call from her. Detective Wilson, I said, picking up the phone. Cal, thank God. You have to come now, she said, almost shouting in my ear. She was clearly upset, so I asked what was wrong. Just come to my house, she said. Not to our house, to my house. Was Jimmy in trouble? I was on shift at the sheriff's office and told Barton that Cydia had called me and asked for time off. He had a strange look on his face, but he just nodded and went back to his crossword puzzle. Then I rushed over to Jimmy and Cynthia's and was surprised to find Julie's car in the driveway, and the alarm bells in my head turned into a full-fledged klaxon. Cynthia was pacing out front, and I saw tears in her eyes as she ran up to me getting out of the car. My unmarked car was actually my car with a radio and sirened headlights. I love my Dodge Charger. Cal, thank God you're here. I don't know what to do. She sobbed against my chest, hugging me tightly. Slow down, Cyn. What's going on? I said in a soothing voice. She looked up at me, and I'm sure my face reflected confusion as I looked at Julie's car and then at her. Suddenly her face went pale and she covered her mouth with her hands. Cyn, what's going on here? Why is my wife's car in your driveway? Are you telling me you don't know? Her eyes got as wide as saucers. No, what? What the hell is going on here, Cyn? I started to lose my temper again, and the alarm sounded twice in my brain. And then it hit me. Bitch! I yelled, grabbing my weapon and heading for the door. I opened the door and walked into the bedroom. As I swung the door open, I saw a picture. I blinked twice, looking at the frozen lovers. My heart jumped out of my chest when I saw Julie and Jimmy. I holstered my gun and looked at Julie. I pulled out my cell phone and started taking pictures. I managed to get 4 pictures before they came to their senses. I can explain, honey, she said as she continued clicking her camera. I ignored her and then turned to Cynthia, who was following me. Cyn, did you know about this? I asked, ignoring my wife. Yes, Cal, I knew. I swear, I thought you did too. It didn't make me happy, but I knew Jimmy needed help when I was out of town. She blushed, but met my gaze firmly. You weren't happy about it, were you? And you thought I knew? I asked, keeping my voice even. Yes. Julie told me she talked to you about it, and since you work on Sundays, she'll come over sometimes. Cynthia cried again. I didn't realize how bad it was until I saw them together. And then an idea hit me. Okay, how about this? I'll take Cyn to my house. Is that okay with you, Cyn? I asked her. No, you're not touching her. Julie and Jimmy seemed to shout this in unison. Cynthia looked at them in disgust, then turned to me. You know what, Cal? I want you to take me to your house. She gave me a cheeky wink. Hell no, Jimmy shouted, jumping up from the bed and heading towards me. I snatched up my weapon. Jimmy, don't be a fool. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. How long have you been cheating on me with my wife? 2 months, he replied, his face contorted with fear and rage. Since the night I was called to Hunter and Sue's house, I said, and he nodded. Yes, that's true, now stop it. I'm still yours, Cal, Julie said. I still love you, Julie pleaded. What, so you can get some on the side and I can't? I looked at her like she'd just dropped off another planet. I looked at Cynthia's black curls and the same green eyes I had. God, she was gorgeous too. My love for Julie had practically blinded me to other women. But now that I saw how things were, I saw Cyn in a different light as well. I looked at Julie again. You hate double standards, right? Well, this is the double standard. If you're going to cuckold me with Jimmy, then I'm going to cuckold Jimmy with Sin. Justice is justice, after all. I can't believe you entertained her in our bed, Cynthia yelled at Jimmy. Baby, take whatever you need for a few days, I said, and Sin nodded, walking over to the dresser and grabbing the essentials. I then looked at Julie again. What's the real reason, Julie? Your job, asshole, she shouted, going on the attack. Her face contorted with rage. You work all the time on our dates and at least Jimmy's around me. Did you have fun with him in our bed? I asked sharply. The question caught her off guard. She stopped before she could begin, and the furious look was replaced by shame. I had my answer before she even uttered it. Yes, she said in a thin voice. Then this will be a good start for the bonfire. I only nodded. When were you going to tell me, Julie? When did you file for divorce? Cal, damn it, it's not like that. I love you. But because you work all the time, we spend so little time together. But I love you. Julie went on the offensive again. Like if I'm cuckolded but still love you, that's okay. No, Julie. You don't love me, or you wouldn't be a cuckold. Especially with him. I replied, and she really had nothing to say to that. She looked at Jimmy. I'm going to live with Cal. If you want to stay married to me, stay away until I get back. I can't believe you two, she shouted after them. We managed to get to my car without incident, but on the way home my cell phone rang. I ignored the calls from Julie, but picked up the phone from the sheriff. Hey Cal, what's going on? Jimmy just called. Sheriff Barton is Jimmy's maternal uncle. Sir, your nephew has been entertaining my wife for the past 2 months, and Cynthia discovered I didn't know about it. As it turns out, she's not thrilled with the situation either. She and I are on our way to my house now, and I'm taking the rest of the day off, and tomorrow too. I held out the compromising material to him. Wow, he sighed. I was afraid something like this would happen. Wait, did you know? I shouted into the phone. I'm sorry, son, he began. Give me a break, asshole, I growled back. I ended the call before he could say anything else. Then I looked at Cynthia. Did you know he knew? I asked. God, no, she said, her face full of surprise. I can't believe this shit. Now she was pissed as hell too. Okay, Cal, when we get back to your place, we need to get serious about this. The fury in her voice was just turning me on. You're damn right. I smirked at her. It was like the first time I saw her as a woman, and not just a friend. But first I need to make some calls and take care of some chores around the house, and then I'll be at your disposal, I promised her. Julie called again just as I brought Sin home. What? I said sharply. Don't you dare, Calvin Wilson, she shouted into the phone. Either I entertain her or divorce you. Which will you choose? I have pictures, remember? I said. In our state, proof of a wife's infidelity disqualified her from participating in the division of property in a divorce. Julie was so silent that at first I thought she had hung up on me. But then she said, okay, after which she ended the call. I sent her a text asking her not to come home today, and then called a locksmith. The locksmith was my cousin Dennis, and I knew I could trust him. When he arrived, he threw Cynthia a questioning look. Sin and I were just having a beer when he arrived and walked in. Hey, Dan, I said as he walked in. What's going on, dude? He asked. I told him the short version, asked him to change the locks and give me 3 sets of keys. I also asked him not to give a set to Julie if she came in and asked for one. He readily agreed. Blood is thicker than water, Cal. He agreed and we shook hands. Dennis is one of the good guys, and I know I can rely on him in any situation. And then I called the furniture store and ordered a new double bed to replace the collapsed double bed Julie and I were sharing. Sin waited patiently through all of this, and soon the movers arrived. They disassembled the old bed and dumped it in a pile in the backyard as I had requested, and then assembled the new bed at my request. It wasn't cheap, but when I was done, it was all worth it. You see, I had a plan. Or rather, I had several plans. I was just hoping that the least violent plan would be the one I could use. Dennis finished changing the locks and gave me 3 sets of keys as ordered. I handed 1 set to Sin, winking at her. She grinned back. The furniture makers finished with the bed, and I paid them off with my credit card. I then called my sister Olivia, the bank manager in our town, and asked her to open a new account for me first thing Monday morning. After explaining the situation, I asked her to transfer 75% of the savings and checking accounts to the new account and thanked her. She was very happy to help as she had disliked Julie from the beginning. It turned out that Liv was a very good judge of character. When everyone who didn't live there or was visiting left, it was just Cynthia and me. Instead of taking her to bed right away, I led her into the living room and we sat on the couch after I locked up the house. Sin, what we're about to do is petty revenge. You do realize that, right? I asked, looking into her green eyes. Yes, I know that, Cal. Before we get past the point of no return, I need to ask you something. I took her hand. Sin, you deserve better than Jimmy, and you always have. I don't understand why you put up with his crap. Cynthia blushed furiously. He has total control of the bank accounts. He said if I left him, I'd be left with nothing. He said he knows every lawyer in town and none of them will take my case. He's lying to you, honey, I said. Listen to me. Do you want to walk away from him? Don't worry about hiring a lawyer. Just answer yes or no. Do you want to get away from that cheating son of a bitch? Yes, but not just because of the cheating. She burst into tears and then pulled up the sleeve of her blouse to show me the bruise on the top of her arm. I closed my eyes and sighed. Shit, I said, shaking my head. This put a new twist on my plan. There's an old boys club in law enforcement around here, and Sheriff Barton and the DA wouldn't want to make a case against Golden Boy unless he really destroyed it. He could have gotten away with it. Now, however, I had dirt on the sheriff. Not only did he know about the affair, but he had facilitated it by leaving me on the job. Honey, listen to me. I am a certified POL in the entire state. Tomorrow I'm going to call a divorce attorney from my wife's rival firm. We'll get a lawyer. Sheriff Barton can't fire me, and he knows that very well. I took a deep breath. I really like you, Sin. I've always liked you. You've been one of my best friends since we were kids, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let that asshole husband of yours hurt you again. With the pictures on my SIM card, you'll have an irrefutable case against him, and you'll get everything. At those words, her eyes lit up. Cal, will you help me, even though I know about this mess? Yes, I will help you, because you didn't know that I didn't know, and you didn't know how deep it went. Now that we know, we'll have to be careful. I know Sheriff Barton, and I know he's probably been dragged into this whole mess somehow. I'll talk to him tomorrow morning and let him know I'm taking the day off, I said. After we hire a lawyer, we'll go to the station together, and if you want, you can charge Jimmy for those bruises. But will he even be able to? She began to ask. Yes, he can, after I show him the pictures. You see, until we file for divorce, we'll hold the threat of divorce over their heads. That's my plan. I smiled as I laid out the plan to her. Cynthia laughed musically. I like the way you think, and here I am, about to get a little revenge before the real revenge begins. No, it wasn't petty revenge anymore. I'd had a lot of contact with Cynthia over the years, and we had a lot in common. From a love of country music and jazz, to similar tastes in movies that even Julie and I didn't share. At that moment, my cell phone buzzed. I put it on vibrate, and when I looked it up, it turned out to be Julie's number. I smirked and answered the call. What now, Julie? I asked in an annoyed tone. Cal, it's not too late for us. We can talk about it. She said it in her whiny voice, which I hated. We can? Will you stop cheating on me? I asked. She started, but I cut the call off and turned the phone off before she could call back. What did she say? Cynthia asked. She said, and that was all the answer I needed. I shrugged. We need to discuss our next steps. She nodded. Yes, we do. I can't go back to Jimmy right now. What we have is too different for me to be happy with him again. Not that I was happy with him to begin with. And then the anger returned when I thought that my own boss had been involved in this whole mess from the beginning. He had distracted me from Julie and given his asshole nephew the opportunity to seduce her. Julie was far from guilt-free too. She could have said no to Jimmy. She could have stopped him at any time. We'd both been played, but I was far worse off than Julie. I told Cynthia how I felt, and a look of guilt and sadness appeared on her face. I'm so sorry, Cal, she said softly, stroking my cheek. Honey, when Julie told you that I was supposedly okay with it, how did she say it? How did she say how I felt about it? I asked. I needed to know what lies Julie had told her. Basically, she said that your feelings mirror mine. And even though you don't like it one bit, you accepted it because you knew she had needs, Cynthia said. My anger at Julie was building. I just nodded. Okay, I'll act like a detective and find out all the details. I outlined my plan to her. She laughed when I finished. You're a conniving bastard, but I love you anyway, she declared, and amusement and love flashed in her eyes. And you're the epitome of a Greek goddess, I said. And I love you too. We spent the rest of the afternoon and evening. After showering, we toweled ourselves dry and headed to the kitchen where Cynthia prepared pork chops with vegetables. She used several different spices she found in the cupboard, and the chops turned out amazing. The vegetables drizzled with cheddar cheese sauce were great too, and soon we were both full to the brim. After we finished eating, we sat down at the table and discussed our plans for the future. I complimented her cooking skills and gave her my word of honor that she was a much better cook than Julie. For a moment my plan stalled, and I realized that I didn't hate Julie anymore. Yes, she was a nasty liar, but she had also brought Sin and I together, albeit unintentionally. No, the mere thought of her cheating on me was enough to reignite my anger, and I swore she'd get nothing from me but what the court would give her after those photos were admitted into evidence. Yes, I had a plan, but it would take a little time to work out all the details and put it into action. When we fell asleep, we found ourselves in each other's arms, which Julie hated. She loved her space while sleeping. Sin, on the other hand, was the complete opposite. She loved to cuddle, and I loved to cuddle. The only real blessing in our impending divorces was that neither of us had children. According to her, Julie and I just weren't ready yet. She wanted to save up some money from her paralegal job, which was making her some pretty decent money before we tried to have a baby. Sin, on the other hand, wanted nothing to do with Jimmy's kids and told him so. She said that after all the crap he'd put up with in the last 2 months, she was damn glad she'd put up with it, even though he begged her to stay home and have kids. Cynthia is a real estate agent and basically sets her own schedule, and since the real estate market is booming in our once horsey city, she makes a living. The challenge was to withdraw money from her and Jimmy's joint bank account. I wanted to get Liv involved, but didn't want the blow to come to her if something went wrong. However, Sin had sales receipts and payroll records from her job. We could sue her for her paycheck and get him off the hook either way. So, having devised a plan, we got in the car the next morning and drove to the lawyer's office. We talked to Phil, Liv's husband, and my brother-in-law, and he took our case at a family discount. In other words, he took the case for a dime and a chance to put the screws to Jimmy. Yeah, Jimmy hit on Liv once, and Phil didn't like it. It was becoming obvious that Jimmy didn't have many friends outside the family. Phil prepared divorce papers for both spouses, and I sent him copies of the photos from the day before to use as evidence. The time code on them was proof enough, and their confessions about how long their affair had lasted gave Phil some leverage to draw up the legal divorce papers. He agreed to gather some real dirt on them and serve them tomorrow, Tuesday. After finishing up business at Phil's office, we headed over to Sheriff Barton's office. "Hey, Bart," said I as I entered the office. I kept my voice even and a smile on my face as Cynthia followed me inside. I sent him the pictures on his phone and told him the reason would be clear soon. I looked at Sin. "Show him what you showed me yesterday." I nodded toward her arm. She pulled back her sleeve, showing the bruise from the grip. "Jimmy does this to me almost every day. Or rather, removes it since I'm not going back. I want to press charges against him." "Well, it could be a tricycle," he started, but I interrupted him. "Bart, unless you want those pictures I just sent you to go all over the internet and be posted on the wall of City Hall, you're going to arrest this scumbag yourself and put him in jail. Then you will go to the district attorney and inform him that a lawsuit needs to be filed. I know that without that leverage, his shit will just get swept under the rug as usual. I don't want to do that, but if I have to, I will." I spelled it out for him. "Now I want to know about your full involvement in Jimmy and Julie's affair. If you don't tell me, those pictures will still become public, and your name will be attached to them as an accessory." Sheriff Barton was on edge, and he knew it. I discreetly turned on the recorder in my pocket just before he started talking. "Ah, shit. I'm sorry about that whole pile of shit, Cal." He wrinkled his nose. "I shouldn't have let Jimmy and Fred talk me into it." "And the mayor, too?" "How did they do it?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. He said that he and Julie loved each other and that he needed me to get you out of his sight so he could be with her. That made me raise a second eyebrow. I was pretty sure Jimmy was lying, but I couldn't be 100% sure. Go on, I nodded. So, it all started the night I called you to go to Hunter and Sue's. Jimmy said that, although they loved each other, they didn't want a divorce and wanted to stay married to you. He took a deep, shuddering breath before continuing. He said that they had an agreement with you that when you were at work or out of town, they would be together, and I figured the case was closed. Well, I had my suspicions, but I didn't want to rock the boat. I knew Cynthia knew, but I assumed you didn't, Cal. But blood is thicker than water, so I kept my mouth shut and brought you out in the open. You have no idea how much I regret it. From the look of misery on his face, I believed him. It didn't change the fact that he'd betrayed me, but I rethought my plan to bury him so deep that he'd never work in law enforcement again. I thought of you as family, Bart. Apparently you treated me differently, I said, shaking my head. No, justice had to be complete. No, it wasn't about revenge anymore. It would be justice for everyone. Everyone would get what they deserved. I sighed and asked him another question. Who else knew about this but you? I asked, and a deer-in-the-headlights expression appeared on his face. It was the same expression on Julie and Jimmy's faces in the pictures I had just sent him. Remember, answer honestly or everyone will know you were involved. As a detective, I had largely mastered the role of the human lie detector. The only one I couldn't recognize was the woman I'd been married to for 10 damn years. She confused the hell out of me. Barton, on the other hand, was an open book compared to her. If I tell you, will you keep my name out of it? Will you wipe the tape off that device in your pocket? He said. You had to hand it to him. He was observant. As a detective, he had to be. It was then that I made the most life-changing decision I could make when it came to Barton's life. I turned off the recorder and erased it in front of him. You're free to go, Barton. I nodded. I was going to give him leeway, but not completely. He would still have to meet his family after I was done. But he would still be able to work in law enforcement. Now tell me who else knows I'm a cuckold, I growled. Only Fred and Jimmy and the other male family members on their side. He said it, and then regretted using the word males. I knew where copies of those pictures would go. I smiled and he turned pale, realizing the depth of his blunder. Shit, he muttered under his breath. So the mayor knows and let it happen too. And Judge Green too. I nodded, confirming his words. One package each was sent to their wives with the slogan, "Your husband knew about this." Janet Green was a good woman and a friend of my parents. They were friends even before she married Fred Green, now mayor of our town. Alice Green, Judge Green's wife, was a bitch, but she too deserved to know what her husband had allowed to happen. And I thought it was odd that Julie hadn't tried to call me today, but that thought had barely had time to flash through my mind when my cell phone buzzed. It was Julie, of course. Detective Wilson, I answered as I usually did when I was on duty. Cal, are you at work? She asked. Yeah, I'm in Bart's office doing paperwork. What's going on? I kept my tone casual. Are you ready to talk yet? She asked. What's there to talk about, Julie? I asked. About the fact that I still love you, she said. About knowing that I know you still love me. That caught me off guard. I realized that even though she'd taken a shit on me, I still had some feelings for her. When would you like to talk? I asked. I can take the day off, but you won't be able to get into the house. I changed the locks, I told her. Why don't you let me in so I can at least get my clothes? Then we can talk, she said. I had to agree. Yeah, no problem. Cynthia will be there too. She's at work with me right now, I said. I figured that would be a good barrier against temptation. I looked at Sin, and a concerned expression appeared on her face. Fine. I heard all the tension in the world in that single word from my wife before she hung up. I looked at Barton again. For that matter, does anyone besides the mayor, you, Judge Green, and Jimmy know that I was duped by him and my wife? No, that's all of us, he nodded. And Cynthia's here too, he said, trying to engage her in conversation. She already told me, and the reason is because Jimmy controls all their money, I growled. And now you're going to send the evidence to the DA? Bart pulled out his digital camera and took a few pictures of the bruise on the gear and a few other bruises on her body. Then he checked them and sent them to his computer to compile an email. Yeah, he'll be on a business trip today. I'll email him when I pick up Jimmy. He nodded. He'd have to do that since he was the only one he could trust besides me to keep quiet about the shit Jimmy had set up. I'll keep quiet, all right, until it's time to keep quiet. Good. The sooner he's off the street, the better. I'd go myself, but you know that. I shrugged. I didn't want to mess with his arrest, especially after the news of his affair with Julie went public. Yeah, I know. I don't support what you're doing, but what he did to you I find unforgivable. And beating his own wife is not something I signed up to defend him against. He'll go down for it if I have anything to say about it. If he wasn't family, I wouldn't be helping him. You gotta believe that, son, Barton said. That touched me. I'd known Sheriff Stanley Bart Barton all my life, and until yesterday, I'd respected and liked the hell out of him. I still liked him now, but my respect for him was permeated with betrayal. I believe you, Bart. I nodded, then stood next to Sin. Now I need to give Julie her clothes and get her out of my house, I said, and shook his hand. Are you coming over tomorrow? He asked. No, I'm officially taking a 5-day vacation starting today. I'll be back next Monday, said I, smiling. Okay, that sounds good. He smiled, and I had a feeling that when the dust settled, he'd be fine. But I wasn't done yet. As promised, I sent Mayor Green and Mrs. Green a letter with all the JPEGs attached and timed it to coincide with Jimmy's arrest by his uncle. When we got home, Julie was already waiting for us. Sin and I walked to the door holding hands and just looked at Julie. She had a jealous look on her face. Hi, Julie, Cynthia said. Do you like my husband? I could ask you the same thing, slut. Julie looked at Cynthia with a smirk. Now that I was comparing them side by side, Sin was superior to Julie in terms of lovemaking. Well, ladies. Julie, what were we saying about double standards? I asked calmly, smiling reproachfully at her. Remember, if you weren't sleeping with Jimmy, I wouldn't be sleeping with Cynthia. That stopped her before she even started her sentence. I continued. Julie, what is there to talk about? You showed me yesterday how much I mean to you. No respect, no love, nothing but contempt. Instead of repenting for what you did, you tried to justify yourself, and then you attacked my work. Now take your shit and get out of my house. Julie couldn't hold back her tears any longer, and the floodgates opened. I'm so sorry, Cal, she sobbed. She was crying for real now, something I'd only seen a few times. I ruined everything. No, you're the one who messed it up. Jimmy beat Cynthia, did you know that? I looked at Sin, who was showing off the bruise on her arm. I know she remembered Sin wearing a lot of makeup at church and could now envision the bruises under that makeup. I remember I didn't pay much attention to it at the time and remarked to Jimmy that she does wear a lot of makeup. Not long after that, I noticed that she wasn't wearing as much makeup as she used to. Oh my God, I'm so sorry, Sin. I didn't know about that. Julie had a look on her face like she had just seen a ghost, or maybe a vision of the future if she left me for Jimmy. There was nothing you could have done, Jules, Sin shrugged. But it's over now, and I'm not going to lie. I'm going to do what I should have done years ago and divorce that creep. I'm going to take his ass to the goddamn cleaners. Me too, I said, looking at Julie. It was time to dictate the terms of her surrender. Julie, we're done. I'm suing for 75% of our joint assets. That's enough for you to buy your own place since the house is in my name and rightfully belongs to me. You can keep your car and I can keep mine. The rest will be split 75-25. If you argue with me, those pictures will go to your family, my family, and anyone else who is interested. I'd prefer it end quickly and cleanly, but I'll fight dirty if I have to. There's no going back. You and I are going to end this. You already know how I feel about cheating. Julie stopped crying. But I love you, Cal, she pleaded. No, Julie. If you loved me, you'd respect me and honor the vows we made when we got married. As far as I'm concerned, when I saw you and Jimmy together yesterday, I divorced you then and there. All that's left is to make it official. You'll be accused of infidelity at work tomorrow. My lawyer has already gotten the pictures into evidence and will present them in court. I paused, letting my words soak in, and then continued. Julie, will you give me a divorce so we can move on with our lives? She lowered her eyes, completely shocked. Yes, she said, in a thin voice that indicated she had lost. Thank you. Now let's get your things together. After today's revelation, I don't think you'll want to go back to Jimmy's place, especially since he was just arrested on domestic battery charges, I said. Yeah, you're right. But where am I going to live? She asked. I left enough money in your account to pay the down payment on the apartment and a few other things. It used to be a joint account, but I transferred 75% to an account in my name and removed my name from the joint account, so it's all yours now. I shrugged. I hope things work out for you, Julie. As much as I'd love to hate you, I just can't. We've known each other too long, but I can't, and won't forgive what you did to me, to us. At those words, Julie grew sad. She was clearly in pain, but I held back. It was really hard to do, but I held back. Hell, part of me wanted to just hug her and tell her everything would be okay, but I knew better. If she loved me, she wouldn't cheat on me. And that was the only thought I needed to finish fighting her sadness and considerable charms. Yes, when viewed objectively and not with a heart full of love, she was no good for Cynthia. But that didn't stop her from being gorgeous in her own right. Cynthia helped us pack all of Julie's things, but it still took almost forever. By the time we were done, it was too late to find an apartment and we were in deep shit. We collapsed in the living room, and most of our suitcases were stuffed with Julie's stuff. Her closet was cleaned out, and her dresser, and nightstand, and makeup table, and bathroom sink, and... well, you get the picture. I didn't realize you had so much stuff, Jules. I chuckled as Cynthia walked in and handed us both a glass of beer and then sat down on my lap. Julie watched us with a wistful expression on her face. No jealousy for once. Just a sense of what she'd discarded. Well, it's been over 10 years since I moved here, and you know I never throw anything away as long as it's wearable. Julie shrugged, and I couldn't keep from giggling again. I know, okay, I smirked. Jules, it's getting late. You can sleep in the guest room if you want. Cynthia leaned in close to my ear. Is that a good idea? She whispered. I don't hate her, Sin. As much as I want to, I can't. I don't love her anymore, but I still care about her, I whispered back. Then I looked at the hopeful expression on Julie's face. Jules, it's just for one night. You can sleep in the guest room, but pack the car in the morning and remember you have to work on your divorce papers. I drove her home. Julie suppressed a sob. Is that really necessary? She asked finally. Can't we just go see your lawyer in the morning and I'll sign everything in his office? I hesitated. As much as I wanted to humiliate her, I also remembered the good times we'd had over the years. It was a damn good thing that memory was a good thing. I looked at Sin and raised an eyebrow. What do you think? Is it worth it? I asked her. Cynthia looked at Julie and saw the utter despair in her eyes. Then she looked into mine again. I think she's suffered enough already. And yes, I think it will work. I looked at Julie. Great. We'll go to Phil's office in the morning. Then you'll sign the papers and we can ask the judge to declare us divorced. We won't have to go to counseling, and we won't have to worry about child custody, so no worries. Julie smiled slightly. She had escaped my wrath. For the moment. The dust hadn't settled yet. Hell, the explosion hadn't even happened yet. I see you've already replaced the bed, she said, her voice still low and full of remorse. Yeah, I still needed to upgrade it. But at the time, I didn't know yet that Shin likes to cuddle. If I had known, I probably would have settled for a two-seater. I smiled and couldn't resist pouring some salt on Julie's wounds. She visibly flinched at the prick. I really wasn't such a good wife, was I? She said, obviously feeling the weight of her decisions. No, you were a good wife until you decided to have fun with not just another guy, but an asshole like Jimmy Green. You knew how I felt about him. Well, the day of reckoning has come. If you don't want to be crushed, I suggest you get out of town as soon as possible when the divorce is final. I told her in an even voice, emphasizing each, I know. A look appeared on Julie's face that spoke of her fear. What do you mean, Cal? I mean what I'm saying, Jules. Look, I have no hatred for you, but there's a storm coming. When the mayor himself allows his son to have fun with another man's wife, knowing full well that his son is wrong, there are going to be serious consequences. The fact that he knew about it, or even allowed it to happen with his blessing, is not illegal. What is definitely illegal, though, is that this husband should be assigned a job for his son to do. I was lying through my teeth, but it was necessary to protect Bart. At least Bart had a conscience, and that should have protected him when I blasted it all over town. I know that Mayor Green was the one who scheduled me for Friday night, even though I usually had the night off, and he made sure I was busy on Sundays too. At those words, Julie's eyes widened. My God, Jimmy used his own father to set us both up? It all made sense, but in a weird sort of way. You see, Jimmy wasn't an asshole by accident. He was taking a cue from his father, who claimed to be the biggest asshole in the universe. Mayor Green was definitely an asshole, and lately he's been more than proving it with his actions. Yes, Mayor Green was number 2 on my list, right after Jimmy Green, but before Judge Green. Bart had crossed himself off the list, but I had a feeling he wouldn't come out of it completely unscathed. I pulled out my cell phone and called Phil. Hey Cal, what's up? He asked, picking up the phone. There's been a change of plans, Phil. Julie is coming over tomorrow morning with me and Sin, and she's going to sign the papers at your office. Is that okay with you? I informed him of the change of plans. Of course, I see no reason not to, but have her bring her lawyer with her. I don't want this to come back and bite us in the ass, he said. Okay, I'll tell her. I nodded. Thanks, Phil. No problem, bro. I got your back, he said, and ended the conversation. I looked at Julie. Bring your lawyer in the morning when we go to Phil's. Julie just hummed and nodded. After finishing our beers, we headed to bed. Julie fell asleep in the guest room and Sin closed the door behind us, and we went to sleep in our bedroom. I had a strange feeling that Cynthia and I would be sharing that bed for the rest of our lives. In the morning, Julie called her attorney and asked him to meet us at Phil's office. After explaining the whole story to him, he gave her a wary look but said nothing as he went through the papers and evidence in the divorce case. When he was done, he handed the papers to Julie. This is the best deal you can get, Jules. Take it and run. That was his advice. Julie, God bless her, followed his advice. 30 days later, after a cooling-off period, we were officially divorced. Divorcing Julie was not the real battle. No, the real battle was with Jimmy Green and his father and uncle at City Hall. But thanks to the letter I sent to their wives, we had an ally in the person of Janet Green. Alice Green did not respond, and I figured she had her own plans to do justice to the honorable judge. Judge Reinhold, no relation, reviewed the evidence and Jimmy was placed under house arrest without bail, thanks to his record, which was hushed up until recently, until it was uncovered by his own dear mom. You see, Jimmy had a huge trust fund from Daddy Dear, and that trust fund was being hunted down by Phil, who is now representing Cynthia in her divorce from Jimmy. Jimmy was stupid enough to resist the divorce, so Phil got the big guns and went after the trust fund. When Jimmy pleaded guilty, he was given probation but kept under house arrest. It wasn't ideal, but for the moment it was okay. At work, I got a call from Cynthia, who was now living with me full-time, informing me that Janet Green was in the house. I said I'd be right over, informed Bart that I had his sister, and he just nodded and smiled. I hurried home. When I arrived, Cynthia and Janet were having coffee in the living room. I'm here, ma'am, I said as I entered the house and kissed Cynthia. Cal, it's good to see you. By the way, thanks for the informative letter. She smiled apologetically. If I had known my son was doing this to the two of you with my husband's full knowledge and cooperation, I would have put a stop to it. Ma'am, not many people knew about that. I shook my head. It would be unfair to say you should have known. My brother knew and let it happen. Her voice became hard. My husband knew and allowed it to happen. My brother-in-law knew and allowed it. This creature who calls himself my son has overstepped his bounds this time. Seducing another man's wife and then using his own family to cover it up. Well, let me tell you that anything I can do, I will do for you. She nodded. I assumed she'd probably support me. But what I hadn't counted on was her swearing us in. Thank you, Janet, Cynthia said, hugging her soon-to-be ex-mother-in-law. Anytime, sweetheart, Janet replied with a smile. Do you think Phil will take my divorce case? She asked as Cynthia sat back down. I think he can be persuaded. I nodded and smiled. Mrs. Green? Janet, Cal, you should know that by now. She smiled admonishingly at me. Okay, Janet, I hope you won't think badly of me for taking on Cynthia, I said, a little wary of how she would take the suggestion. "Nonsense, Cal," she laughed. "You both deserve to be happy, and considering what Julie and Jimmy did to you, I have a feeling you both should be happy with each other. I know I could sue Jimmy, his father, and maybe even both uncles for alienation of affection. But why? Most of the time it's just a bullshit lawsuit, and it's almost impossible to prove. No, what I had planned for Jimmy and his father was much, much worse. After all my investigations into the how, why, and from where, I came to the conclusion that Mayor Green, in collusion with his son, was plotting to destroy my marriage. I considered charging him with bribery as well as solicitation by proxy. The judge, although knowledgeable, was only guilty of not telling me what I should have known. Julie wanted nothing to do with Jimmy and left town shortly after our divorce was finalized. Her boss found her a good job in another city with an old friend of his from law school. She took my advice and quit the AO before the shitstorm destroyed the fan base. Bart fully cooperated with me on everything and apologized to my sister for his part in what happened. He confirmed my suspicions that Mayor Green himself had told him that if he didn't go along with Jimmy's plan, he would lose his job as sheriff and be replaced by an idiot of the mayor's choosing. Despite all his faults, Bart has always been a damn good sheriff. Any replacement chosen by Mayor Green would have been bad for the police force. As it happened, Bart and Janet were sitting down to dinner one night with Cynthia and me, and we had some damn good fried chicken cooked by Cyn herself. Yeah, she's great in bed, and she can cook. And Jimmy gave her up for Julie? Well, sometimes you can't argue with taste. After dinner, drinking beer, we discussed the plan. I laid out the basics and said the deadline would be moved up a bit, so Mayor Green could be served with the divorce papers first. The whole city would get a goddamn enema. The first order of business was to contact Phil and see what his private investigator had managed to dig up. I called him, and the report was good. He got a lot of dirt on our glorious mayor and his asshole son. Janet had long blamed herself for the way she'd raised Jimmy, but after we assured her he was his father's son, she finally reconciled. I couldn't blame her. She told us how her husband had changed over the years from a kind, wonderful man to a treacherous tyrant. I remembered the old saying, "Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." This applied to Mayor Green and the way he ran our city. In the end, it came down to the fact that by using his son as a proxy, he showed everyone that no woman was immune to him. I felt sorry for Julie when I learned that fact. The recording of the conversation made me cringe when Phil played it back to us in his office. Mayor Green, "Just divorce her, Jimmy. Give that bitch what she wants and I'll run her out of town." Jimmy, "But Daddy, she can't divorce me. She's mine, and I can do whatever I want with her." Mayor, "Jimmy, let's get this over with. People are starting to talk and we need to get rid of this as soon as possible. Don't worry about Cal. I'll get him fired and run him out of town on the rails. We need Cynthia to go with him. You've screwed up enough already." Jimmy, "How can you say that, Papa? You're the one who told me Julie was ready. You're the one who made Bart work harder and call more." Mayor, "But you're the one who let her escape." Jimmy, "I was in jail, if you don't remember. How was I to know that Cynthia would turn me in for correcting her?" Mayor, "Don't worry about Cynthia. I got plans for that bitch. Take care of yourself and lay low for a while." Jimmy, "All right, Daddy. Just make sure she doesn't go through with this divorce. Make it look like an accident." Phil stopped the tape, looked at Cynthia and Janet, then at Bart. "That's enough to prove collusion," Bart said, and Phil nodded in agreement. Then Bart looked at me. "Care to do the honors, son?" I grinned and checked my Colt. "I'd be honored, sir," I grinned. Then I looked at Cyn. "Honey, you stay here with Phil. Bart and I need to put some rabid dogs to sleep." Cynthia put her arms around me and kissed me hard, putting her whole heart and soul into that kiss. "Be careful, baby," she whispered. "I love you." "I love you too, sweetheart," I said, smiling encouragingly at her. "Don't worry, Bart and I can handle it." We got into Bart's car outside Phil's office. He turned on the headlights and siren, and we raced toward the mayor's estate where Jimmy now lived. On the way, he called Judge Reinhold, still no relation, and got a warrant for their arrest based on a private investigator's wiretap. Gotta love the Patriot Act. When we arrived, Mayor Green was just finishing dinner with his son, and they didn't even hear us pull up after Bart turned off the siren. We pulled up in front of the mansion and went inside with guns at the ready. Bart proved he still had a gun when he kicked the door open. "What the hell is going on here?" Mayor Green demanded. A look of pure terror appeared on Jimmy's face as he saw my .357 pistol and Bart's .44 caliber single barrel pointed at them. I backed Jimmy up as Bart moved forward and set the charges. "Frederick Green, you and your son Jimmy Green are under arrest on charges of conspiracy to commit murder. You have the right to remain silent. If you waive this right, anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney and to have an attorney present during questioning. Do you understand these rights as I have enumerated them to you?" Bart holstered the Colt and buckled the handcuffs behind Fred's back, making sure they were well buttoned and the keyholes were away from his hands. He then sat the mayor down and cradled Jimmy while I read him his rights and cuffed him. When they were both handcuffed and stowed in the back seat of Bart's Charger, we went back to the station and processed them. Jimmy, showing rare ingenuity, kept his stupid mouth shut. Once Fred was in the cell and Jimmy in the interrogation room, I went in there with Cynthia by my side. I laid out the papers in front of him and then turned on a tape of him confessing in general terms to killing his wife. Jimmy listened to it all the way through and then turned noticeably pale. Every drop of blood turned to ice in his veins as he realized how deeply mired in this shit. This can't be admissible in court," he tried. "It doesn't matter, Jimmy." I shrugged. "What matters here is the court of public opinion. If we use the Patriot Act, suspecting you and your father of harboring domestic terrorists, and show Homeland this conversation, it could easily be misconstrued as planning an execution, an act of terrorism." I was talking thick, but I was having a hell of a lot of fun doing it. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, broken. He knew we had him cornered, and he knew he was going to get a big green weenie with no lube and a condom with sandpaper if he didn't play ball. "As soon as your lawyer comes, you're going to sign this paper giving Cynthia everything. He'll witness it, and then everything will go to the judge. The judge will give everything to Cynthia. You'll go to jail, and then you'll get out and live your life the way it's going to be. Do you understand how things are going to work out?" I asked, and he only nodded in response. It felt damn good to see Golden Boy go down a few dozen steps. "Jimmy, if you hadn't gotten it into your head to seduce my wife, none of this would have happened. You married the wrong person, asshole." "Man, I'm sorry," he cried, the first time I'd ever seen him cry. Jimmy Green was crying. I looked at Cynthia, and she looked at me, and our faces expressed pure shock. Then we smiled at each other and looked again at the sobbing, crying, apologizing Jimmy Green. "Shut up, Jimmy," Cynthia snapped back. "You and your asshole father were going to kill me. You're just sorry you got caught." That snapped Jimmy out of his daze. He finally realized the mess he was in, and his brain practically shut down. He just stared at the wall between us and sin. When his lawyer came in, I played him the tape and he closed his eyes and let out an intermittent sigh. When I laid out my plan to send the tape to the local news stations and even the major TV stations, he was able to get Jimmy out of his self-imposed state and get him to sign the divorce papers. We were able to do the same thing with Fred Green, and he signed the papers without a fight as soon as his lawyer arrived. And since we never wrote that we would withhold evidence if they cooperated, we went ahead and sent copies of the tape to news stations, the big three networks, and even Fox News, and then sent a copy to the state attorney general's office. It was as if a small thermonuclear device had exploded in our quiet town. News vans were whizzing around everywhere. Law enforcement, from state police officers to the FBI, flooded our little town, and the motel business was booming. For the small farming community, we were raising money for the town coffers, and it turned out to be a hell of a lot of fun for everyone but Jimmy and Fred Green. The feds dug deeper and found some questionable tax practices in Fred's past, and a few oddities in Jimmy's day-to-day dealings at City Hall. When the dust finally settled, Bart was cleared of all charges, although Jimmy and Fred tried to throw him under the bus over the scam scandal, but he got away with it. Julie was subpoenaed to testify about the whole thing, and the assholes at the news mocked her for a while until I laid it all out and portrayed her as a victim. She was young and naive. I was asked in an interview if I would have reconciled with her, to which I answered with a firm no. I wouldn't argue with that. Cynthia got everything in her divorce from Jimmy, and Janet got everything in her divorce from Fred. They got solid prison sentences for conspiracy and other charges the feds found a way to bring against them. They will most likely die in prison when the guilty verdicts and sentences are handed down. Cynthia and I got married and her relatives came back to town for our wedding. Julie came, having received an invitation, and brought her new boyfriend with her. I talked to him, and he turned out to be quite a nice man. There you go. I was actually happy for her. Jimmy found love again, as I learned from talking to him. As it turned out, his cellmate was a very large but very loving man. Jimmy's farts stopped being noisy after his 6th month in prison. Jimmy's uncle, Judge Roy Green, came under investigation along with his brother and nephew, and the feds found a number of irregularities in his cases and sentences. It turned out that he had taken bribes and engaged in other nefarious activities. It also turned out that Alice was the one who turned him into the feds. I wonder why. Anyway, he ended up at Club Fed after Alice brought him to light during their divorce. As for Fred, the former mayor, he played in many prison musicals, usually singing soprano parts. And Julie ended up marrying the guy she brought to Sin and I's wedding, and they now live in town. From what I hear, she's having a baby. Good for her. Bart retired and is now living out his golden years with his wife. They have empty nestlings by now, but he still shows up at the office occasionally. I became sheriff after a new mayor was elected. Mayor Barton is a divorced woman who, when her ex-husband abused his power, stood up for him, earning the trust of the people of our town. Yes, Janet took her husband's place and appointed me sheriff after Bart resigned. Now I sit here, years after that fateful day when I was called back after a date with Julie, and here I am holding my young son in my arms while a very pregnant Cynthia feeds our 2-year-old daughter, and life is good. We've turned the guest room into a nursery, and our toddler has his own room. We have 4 bedrooms, and Cynthia has already made it clear that this will be the last baby. She plans to get her tubes tied after this baby is born, or as she puts it, the baby factory is closing, but the playground will be up and running. I love my wife. Let me say it right now. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, so subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.